Black woman denied priority boarding moments later. She conducts a surprise FAA inspection. Imagine standing at the bustling gate of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, a first-class ticket in your hand, only to be told you don't belong in the priority line. Imagine the stares, the hushed whispers, and the raging sense of injustice burning inside your chest because you know you followed every rule, paid every dime, and deserve every bit of courtesy you were promised. But instead of bending under discrimination, you steel yourself. Unbeknownst to everyone around, you hold a power far greater than a boarding pass. This is the story of how one black woman turned an act of prejudice into a resounding moment of karmic reckoning. Ebony Baxter was no stranger to airplanes. In her 28 years of life, she had crisscrossed the country more times than she could recount, logging frequent flyer miles that dwarfed even the most jet-setting executives. What was unusual, however, was her reason for flying that day. On the surface, her itinerary suggested a simple trip from Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport to Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. She had scheduled a short stay in Dallas before returning to her office in Washington, D.C. The official reason for her travel was some last minute operational assessments, but Ebony knew exactly what that meant in code. She was there to investigate flight operations for compliance with the Federal Aviation Administration's strict regulations. She kept her real purpose hidden from the public eye. No one needed to know she was working for the FAA. Ebony had done this countless times, traveling in plain clothes, blending in with the crowds. She had the demeanor of a seasoned traveler, calm, patient, used to random announcements of gate changes and scheduling delays. She generally had no trouble, especially because she always booked priority boarding, sometimes even first-class seats under a standard government contract meant to expedite these surprise inspections. While Ebony preferred to maintain a low profile, having a first-class ticket was part of how she could swiftly move through the typical airport chaos. But that morning, something felt tense in the air, as though an invisible thread was pulling events toward an eventual confrontation. Beyond her official role, Ebony carried the weight of personal experiences. Over the years, she had grown used to side-eye glances whenever she lined up at a boarding gate for first-class passengers. People occasionally assumed she had taken a wrong turn. Some politely inquired if she had mistaken the lines. Others were less polite. She had learned to ignore it. For the most part, her position and responsibilities required composure. Her family, especially her parents, had taught her resilience and the power of maintaining dignity in humiliating situations. Yet the sting of prejudice never truly dulled, no matter how many times it occurred. On that fateful morning, Ebony arrived at Gate A27 of Hartsfield-Jackson with time to spare. She knew better than to sprint through airports at the last minute. It left no opportunity to observe the environment or note anything unusual. Early arrivals allowed her to watch how gate agents interacted with passengers, how announcements were made, whether boarding processes adhered to the airline's policies. She had a comfortable hour to assess the scene, cross-check details, and mentally prepare for what she might uncover once she was airborne. A glint of tension formed when Ebony noticed the gate agent. The woman, whose name tag read Cheryl, exuded an air of impatience. She snapped at an older couple who approached with a question about carry-on baggage, rolling her eyes as they walked away. Ebony, sitting quietly nearby, felt the wave of irritation roll off Cheryl. Next came a businessman, pressing to board early so he could store a large garment bag in the overhead bin. Cheryl dismissed him curtly, but eventually scanned his pass and waved him through. Ebony took a moment to reflect on how gate agents, especially those working morning shifts, had to deal with a constant influx of needs, queries, and demands. Customer service could be challenging, but Ebony made a mental note to watch how Cheryl handled the wide spectrum of travelers. When first-class boarding began, Ebony stood in line behind a tall, blonde woman in a sleek business suit. Directly ahead, a traveling father with 2 children also queued, though Ebony suspected they belonged in a different group due to the airline's family boarding policy. The line moved quickly. The blonde woman breezed through with a polite smile from Cheryl. The father with kids received some mild pushback, but after checking his boarding pass, Cheryl let them through as well, albeit with minimal warmth. Then came Ebony's turn. Ebony handed over her first-class boarding pass with a polite good morning. Cheryl barely glanced at the ticket before replying in a tone as frosty as polar ice, "You're not in this lane." Ebony raised an eyebrow. "I have a first-class ticket. This is the priority lane, isn't it?" Cheryl's gaze swept over Ebony in a way that made Ebony feel as though she were being sized up and found wanting. "The next group hasn't been called yet," Cheryl insisted. Ebony could sense onlookers beginning to pay attention. A hush replaced the normal hustle and bustle as each traveler tried to pretend they weren't eavesdropping. Ebony maintained her composure. "According to what I heard, first-class boarding has started. Here's my ticket." She gestured calmly, handing it closer. It clearly indicated Seat 2A, first class. Cheryl sighed, her exasperation flaring up. It was impossible for her not to see Ebony's seat assignment, yet she kept looking for a reason to deny her. Ebony felt the tension coil in her stomach, that familiar pang of subtle discrimination. She was well aware that gate agents typically scanned the passenger's ticket right away. The fact that Cheryl was simply staring at her name and seat number without scanning was itself a red flag. Ebony realized she couldn't allow this moment to pass unnoticed. She would stand her ground, politely but firmly. Cheryl's final attempt to dismiss Ebony came out in a low hiss. "Ma'am, the next group is economy, and that's where you should be lining up. Please don't hold up the priority lane." The hush had grown now into a near-complete silence as other passengers watched with rapt attention. Ebony took a breath to steady herself. She could feel her cheeks flushing with anger. Should she just flash her FAA credentials? But no, that was not how she wanted to begin. She was here in an undercover capacity, a vital part of her role. So Ebony decided to abide by protocol, handle the situation as any other paying passenger would, then document it thoroughly. Surprisingly, not a single passenger in line spoke up in Ebony's defense. Maybe some were too stunned or lacked the full context. Maybe some feared confrontation. Ebony could see pity in one woman's eyes and confusion in another man's. The father she had seen earlier looked back briefly, then turned away. Ebony wasn't exactly disappointed. She had learned not to expect every bystander to intervene, but it fueled the sense of isolation that bubbled under her self-control. Staring straight at Cheryl, Ebony repeated calmly, "I'm in seat 2A. She pointed to the words first class printed on the boarding pass. "I would appreciate if you'd honor the ticket I purchased." Ebony's voice trembled slightly with emotion, but she maintained her civility. Cheryl's eyes flicked across Ebony's traveling attire. Ebony wore a tailored black blazer and matching slacks, not the typical sweatpants or leggings so many travelers wore. There was nothing outwardly suspicious about Ebony's clothes. If anything, Ebony presented herself as a neat professional. Yet, Ebony could see the flicker of prejudice in Cheryl's posture, her pressed lips, her unwavering stance that said, "You don't belong here." Finally, with a grand flourish of reluctance, Cheryl scanned the boarding pass. The beep that confirmed Ebony's legitimate seat seemed to echo louder than normal. Some watchers blinked in relief, others returned to their phones. Cheryl said nothing more, simply stepping aside. Ebony was allowed to board, but the damage was done. Once on the jet bridge, Ebony pressed her eyes shut for a moment, heart pounding, both furious and saddened. But she had to focus. She was on assignment, and ironically, this entire fiasco would likely find its way into the official report. Stepping into the aircraft, Ebony tried to shake off the tension. She made a mental note. Gate agent attempted to deny legitimate first-class passenger from boarding. She reminded herself that her job was not to bring personal vendettas into official evaluations. However, Ebony was human, and the sting still lingered. The quietness of the first-class cabin momentarily comforted her. Plush leather seats, crisp overhead lighting, and an attentive flight attendant at the front of the aisle offering greetings. "Good morning, welcome aboard," the flight attendant, whose name tag read Carlos, said with a genuine smile. Ebony forced a polite nod, trying to calm her breathing. She settled into seat 2A, stowed her carry-on in the overhead bin, and placed her personal item under the seat in front of her. As Ebony waited, her mind churned. She recalled the training sessions that all FAA inspectors undergo, less about the technicalities of airplane mechanics and more about the complexities of passenger experience and staff behavior. The federal guidelines Ebony was authorized to enforce encompassed everything from pilot licensing and maintenance checks to ensuring passenger rights were upheld. Although Ebony's specialty was operational safety, the FAA also took note when airlines or staff engaged in behaviors that could lead to formal complaints. Discriminatory practices at any point in the passenger journey were not only morally reprehensible, but could also lead to lawsuits and severe penalties if patterns were proven. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from her supervisor at the FAA, a quick check-in. "Let me know if you spot anything unusual. Safe travels." Ebony smirked bitterly. If only her supervisor knew the half of it already. She typed back a succinct response. "All good so far. Flight departing soon. Will follow up." When the rest of the passengers boarded, Ebony noticed the father with 2 children was seated in economy, about 3 rows behind the first-class cabin curtain. She observed the businessmen in suits, the casual travelers in sweatshirts, a few families, and a handful of older couples. Eventually, the seat next to Ebony remained empty, and she guessed it might stay that way unless there was a last-minute occupant. Sometimes first class had open seats, especially on midweek flights. The flight attendants made their pre-takeoff announcements, reminding everyone to stow their laptops and switch devices to airplane mode. Ebony fastened her seatbelt, a motion she had done hundreds of times before, yet her stomach churned again. She couldn't shake the tension from the gate incident. It clung to her like static, refusing to dissipate. Cheryl, the gate agent, had disappeared, presumably returning to the desk to handle last-minute travelers or boarding passes. Ebony wondered if Cheryl even realized that Ebony was more than a passenger. Did she suspect Ebony might have the power to raise serious concerns to airline management and the FAA? Probably not. People who judge too quickly seldom consider the ripple effects of their actions. Ebony decided to keep Cheryl's unprofessionalism on record, though, not out of malice, but out of a duty to accurate reporting. If Ebony let it slide without mention, would that embolden Cheryl to continue that behavior with other passengers? Just when Ebony anticipated the plane to push back from the gate, she felt a jolt. Not physical turbulence, but a sudden shift in the environment. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a slight mechanical issue that needs further inspection before we can depart. We apologize for the inconvenience. Please remain seated, and we'll keep you updated." A collective groan spread through the cabin. Ebony's interest, however, piqued. A mechanical issue could mean many things. A light on a panel flickered incorrectly, a hydraulic fluid reading was off, or something as simple as a stuck latch on the cargo door. These minor delays were not uncommon, but Ebony's mind automatically went into an investigative mode. She had permission to do on-site inspections at her discretion, especially in cases involving mechanical anomalies. While the airline's maintenance crew typically handled these, Ebony was legally empowered to intervene or observe if she deemed it necessary. Carlos, the first-class flight attendant, walked down the aisle, offering water or juice to calm restless travelers. Ebony accepted a small cup, scanning the expressions of those around her. Most people looked annoyed at the prospect of a delay. Some, with connecting flights in Dallas, were checking their phones, possibly rearranging schedules. Ebony, however, was calmly watching the flight attendants' interactions. Everyone in the cabin seemed to receive courtesy, a stark contrast to what Ebony had experienced at the gate. Ebony heard muffled voices from the open cockpit door. She knew better than to eavesdrop openly, but her seat in 2A gave her an advantageous vantage point. Pilots often discuss last-minute checks, mechanical statuses, and coordination with ground control. However, Ebony sensed friction in the tone of the conversation, something beyond the usual pilot-mechanic interplay. Moments later, a maintenance technician stepped onto the plane, his neon safety vest brushing the aisle seats as he made his way to the cockpit. Ebony watched discreetly, still sipping her water. A sense of foreboding slithered through her gut. She recognized that sometimes an aggressive timeline from management can pressure pilots to take off faster than recommended, or a gate agent might push for an on-time departure even if the plane needed more thorough checks. The FAA always preached safety over schedule, but Ebony knew not everyone followed that principle in practice. As the technician disappeared into the cockpit, Ebony debated whether to step forward and introduce herself as an FAA inspector. Normally, her protocol was to remain incognito unless a pressing safety issue emerged that required immediate FAA oversight. She decided to give the crew a moment. She would see if they could resolve the mechanical glitch professionally, but Ebony was a firm believer in the old adage, trust but verify. In the midst of her deliberation, Ebony was approached by Carlos. He leaned in, his voice low. "Ma'am, I couldn't help but notice you seemed upset during boarding. Is everything all right? If there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable, please let me know." His expression was genuine, showing concern that Ebony found refreshing. Ebony forced a small smile. She hadn't expected a flight attendant to notice or follow up. "Thank you, I appreciate it. Just had a unpleasant experience at the gate, but you've been very kind. I'm all right." Carlos nodded, glancing around to ensure he wasn't overheard. "I only ask because I saw the way Cheryl acted. You're not the first passenger to complain about her." He hesitated, then added, "She's had warnings before for her attitude. I've even seen her be downright rude to older people who can't walk fast. I wish the airline would do something." Ebony's eyebrows shot up. "Does she ever get formally reported?" Carlos lowered his voice further. "Well, she's been reported by a few passengers, but she's still here. So either those complaints never went anywhere, or someone higher up is protecting her. Sometimes it feels like the system doesn't really act unless something big happens." Ebony thanked him, her mind whirring. Perhaps it was time for that something big if Cheryl's behavior was systemic. Ebony made a mental note to check the airline's internal records, or at least see if there were any documented patterns about gate agent issues on her official channels. She'd also noted in her personal ledger she kept for FAA visits, though Ebony typically focused on flight operations. Discriminatory conduct by airline staff could be flagged for a broader Department of Transportation or even a civil rights compliance check. After several more minutes, the maintenance technician emerged, walking briskly down the aisle. Ebony overheard snippets. "It's not reading right. Sensor might be faulty, but we need to check the system thoroughly." Then the pilot's voice called out, "We're on a tight schedule here. See what you can do." This was the exact type of scenario Ebony was trained to evaluate. A pilot balancing operational schedules against mechanical warnings could lead to a dangerous game of risk calculation. Ebony carefully rose from her seat and signaled Carlos. "Would you mind if I spoke with the pilot for just a moment?" She hinted it was official business. Carlos looked momentarily confused, then realized Ebony might be more than she appeared. Of course, let me check with them first," he replied. Moments later, Ebony was beckoned to the cockpit. The captain, a graying man with a rugged face and calm demeanor, turned in his seat. "Hi there, I'm Captain Miles," he said, not unkindly, but with an edge of impatience. He probably expected Ebony to complain about the delay. "Is everything all right?" Ebony displayed her FAA credentials discreetly, preventing passengers from noticing. "I'm Ebony Baxter, FAA," she said quietly. "I'm conducting a routine, unannounced inspection. I happened to witness the mechanical delay. If it's all right, I'd like to observe or at least verify that everything is being handled in accordance with procedure." For a heartbeat, Ebony thought she saw a flicker of worry on Captain Miles's face. He composed himself quickly. "Certainly, Miss Baxter, we've got a sensor malfunction. My first officer and I flagged it during pre-flight checks. The maintenance team is trying to confirm if the sensor is giving a false reading or if there's a genuine issue with the system. It's standard procedure, but I understand your need to check." Ebony nodded. "I appreciate your cooperation." She noticed the first officer, a younger woman with sharp eyes, glancing nervously between Ebony and the instrument panel. Ebony addressed her too, nodding politely. "I'll be out of your way, but do let me know if you need anything from my side." The pilot cleared his throat. "Of course." Returning to her seat, Ebony decided that if the mechanical issue took too long, she might step off the plane for a more thorough inspection with the maintenance team. The airline's standard operating procedures mandated a maximum time for investigating such anomalies before either switching aircraft or delaying the flight significantly. Ebony kept track of the time. Meanwhile, the other passengers grew restless. 10 minutes later, an announcement came over the PAR system. "Folks, we're almost done with the checks. We appreciate your patience." Ebony could sense the wave of exasperation rolling through the cabin. The father behind her tried to console his cranky children. 2 rows ahead, an older man complained loudly to a flight attendant about a missed connection. Ebony pressed her lips together. She empathized with them. Travel disruptions were never fun. Yet Ebony decided not to wait passively any longer. She stood, made her way to the front, and quietly asked a different flight attendant if she could speak briefly to the lead maintenance technician. The flight attendant, apparently having been informed by Carlos that Ebony was important, complied, guiding her off the plane and onto the jet bridge. There, Ebony found a slender, middle-aged man in a fluorescent vest, poring over a checklist on a tablet. "Excuse me," Ebony said gently. "I'm Ebony Baxter with the FAA. I understand you're assessing a sensor malfunction." He looked up, startled, but then gave a polite nod. "Oh yes, ma'am. I'm Joseph Rodriguez, lead tech on this shift. We're just about finished. Our preliminary tests indicate the sensor is faulty, not the system itself, but we're confirming." Ebony gestured to the tablet. "Mind if I see the logs?" Joseph hesitated only briefly before handing over the device. Ebony skimmed through the standard fault codes. The sensor in question was an external flap sensor that reads whether certain control surfaces are locked properly for takeoff. Ebony breathed a small sigh of relief. If the flaps themselves were functioning and only the sensor was sending a false alert, it was indeed a simpler fix. The airline had the discretion to replace or override the sensor if they could confirm the flaps were operational. Ebony reminded herself that she was primarily there to ensure no corners were cut. "I see," she murmured, handing the tablet back. "Have you tested the flap extension physically as well?" Joseph nodded vigorously. "Yes, ma'am. We ran a full extension on the ground." The flaps respond normally. We also visually confirmed no mechanical obstructions. We just need the green light that the faulty sensor reading won't cause an erroneous warning mid-flight. Ebony felt satisfied. All right, I appreciate it. Let's get everyone airborne safely. Returning to the aircraft, Ebony noticed a new tension had emerged among the crew. Word had evidently spread that there was an FAA inspector on board. The pilot and first officer were polite but guarded. Carlos and the other flight attendants seemed to stand straighter, speak more precisely. Ebony understood the psychological effect her presence had. She represented authority and the possibility of sudden audits or penalty reports. Yet Ebony tried not to let that overshadow the main point of the flight. It was supposed to be routine for all passengers. Ebony found her seat again, heart heavy with the knowledge that the gate agent's behavior was also on her mental checklist. Whether or not Ebony chose to formally escalate, that was still a decision she wrestled with. Yes, Ebony had the power, but she also believed in fairness. If the airline's staff corrected their mistakes and provided better training, Ebony would be satisfied. However, Ebony's instincts told her that Cheryl's attitude wasn't a one-off. Shortly thereafter, Joseph gave the cockpit a thumbs up from the jet bridge, signaling that the sensor replacement or override was complete. Captain Miles announced they would be departing shortly. Relief cascaded through the cabin. Seatbelts clicked, flight attendants performed the safety demonstration, and Ebony couldn't help but notice how especially articulate Carlos was in explaining the emergency procedures. Finally, the plane pushed back, the engines roared, and Ebony felt the familiar surge of acceleration as the aircraft barreled down the runway. She always loved the moment of takeoff, the brief suspension of everyday reality as wheels lifted from the ground. It was a reminder of how far technology had come, how human ingenuity literally allowed people to soar through the skies. Climbing into the clouds, Ebony glanced out the window. The Atlanta skyline receded beneath a blanket of white. She let her shoulders relax. Although she had a job to do, she would have a few hours of flight time to gather her thoughts, reflect on the gate incident, and plan her next steps in Dallas. Perhaps she would conduct a standard cabin inspection mid-flight, checking lavatories, verifying emergency equipment was in place. She'd keep it discreet so as not to alarm other passengers. After reaching cruising altitude, the flight attendants began beverage service. Carlos offered Ebony a complimentary drink, which she graciously accepted just as sparkling water. As Ebony took a sip, she heard an abrupt cough from someone in the row behind her. She turned to see if everything was okay. The father with the two children was rummaging through the seat pockets for an air sickness bag. Ebony offered a sympathetic look. Traveling with kids was tough enough. Add in mechanical delays and potential air sickness, and you had a recipe for stress. The seatbelt sign flicked on sooner than expected. The pilot's voice rang out, "We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the sign is turned off." Ebony's senses sharpened. Unexpected turbulence was normal, especially when crossing certain weather patterns, but Ebony always paid special attention to how the crew handled it. The flight attendants quickly secured the drink carts and began a seat-by-seat check to ensure compliance. Carlos swiftly maneuvered through the aisles, assisting passengers. Ebony took note. Each flight attendant was calm, professional, and clear in their instructions. The real test of an airline crew often came during these small crises. Ebony scribbled a quick note in the small notepad she kept in her blazer pocket. Cabin crew excellent, cohesive, well-trained, calm under turbulence. She underlined it, wanting to highlight that not all staff were failing their duties. Far from it. As the plane rocked gently, Ebony couldn't help but reflect on the power dynamic that existed between herself the airline employees, and the other passengers. She could make or break careers with a few lines in a report, yet she never abused that power. She was here to ensure safety and fairness, not to stoke fear. She wished people like Cheryl understood that. Ebony's thoughts drifted again to the gate agent's blatant discrimination. The memory renewed a flicker of anger, but Ebony kept it contained. She would handle it when the time came. Once the turbulence subsided and the seatbelt sign turned off, Ebony decided to discreetly conduct her in-flight cabin inspection. Normally, she would do this only on longer flights, but given the mechanical delay and the general undercurrent of tension, Ebony wanted to be thorough. She signaled Carlos, who nodded in understanding, then allowed Ebony access to the galley area. She stepped behind the curtain that separated first class from the galley, pulling out her notepad. She checked the emergency equipment, portable oxygen bottles, life vests, fire extinguishers, the emergency medical kit. She cross-referenced the required items. Everything was in order. She peeked into the small compartments where flight attendants store personal items or additional supplies. Spotless. Ebony also checked the alignment of the cabin seats, ensuring that safety cards were properly placed. All seemed to meet regulations. Her final step was to speak briefly with the flight attendants about their training logs. Typically, Ebony would do that on the ground, but she wanted a quick verbal confirmation. She approached Carlos. "How recent was your last recurrent training?" Ebony asked softly. 3 months ago, he replied. "We do them every year, plus additional refreshers for certain procedures." Ebony nodded, satisfied. She thanked him for his cooperation, then returned to her seat. If only everything about this flight were so flawless. Sinking back into seat 2A, Ebony tried to let her mind rest, but she couldn't. The confrontation with Cheryl at the gate replayed in her head over and over. She thought about how quickly humiliation can escalate, how it could have ruined someone else's trip. Ebony had the emotional and professional tools to handle it, but what if another passenger faced such discrimination and didn't have Ebony's resilience or rank? She felt compelled to do something, but the question was how to proceed in a way that would create lasting change rather than a fleeting disciplinary action. She reasoned that a single complaint, even from an FAA inspector, might not guarantee Cheryl would face real consequences if her superiors were indifferent or protective. Ebony had seen it happen, official complaints lost in bureaucratic processes, overshadowed by labor union complications, or overshadowed by an airline's desire to avoid scandal. Ebony wanted accountability, but more so, she wanted transformation, a shift in how certain staff members treated black travelers, or any travelers who might be perceived as not belonging in first class. In the midst of her swirling thoughts, Ebony realized the seat next to her, 2B, had been occupied at some point by a man in business casual attire. She had been so focused that she hadn't noticed him board. It seemed he was a standby passenger or a last-minute upgrade. Now, he regarded Ebony with a curious expression. "Excuse me," he began softly, leaning toward Ebony. "I couldn't help but notice. Earlier at the gate you seemed to have some trouble boarding?" His tone suggested genuine concern rather than nosiness. Ebony offered a measured smile. "Yes, the gate agent tried to tell me I was in the wrong line, but it's been resolved." She kept her response short, unsure of his angle. He extended a hand. "I'm Tristan Keller. I've been traveling for business for about 15 years now. Honestly, I've seen some stuff like that before. It's never right." Ebony shook his hand, feeling a subtle wave of relief that at least one passenger wanted to acknowledge the injustice. "Ebony Baxter," she replied. "I'm traveling for work as well." She left it vague. Tristan nodded. "Well, I'm sorry you had to deal with that. People can be petty. If it's any consolation, I'm sure there are ways to report that. My cousin works in human resources for a major airline, and I know that repeated complaints can accumulate. Don't let it slide if it really bothered you. Ebony studied him for a moment, gauging his sincerity. He seemed earnest, perhaps even a little hesitant, not wanting to overstep. She appreciated that. "Thanks. I'll consider it," Ebony replied. "It's not just about me. It's about making sure no one else faces the same hostility." Tristan nodded, then shifted in his seat, returning to his book, which Ebony noticed was about leadership strategies. She took a mental note. Not everyone in first class was complicit in the silent acceptance of discrimination. Some wanted to help, even in small ways. The remainder of the flight passed without incident. Ebony read over some FAA guidelines on her tablet, scanning changes to certain safety protocols. She also mentally rehearsed her next steps upon landing, do a quick post-flight review, note anything out of order, then check in with the local FAA branch in Dallas. She planned to stay in the city for a day or two, investigating other scheduled flights and possibly reviewing some training logs. But Ebony also mulled over how best to address the gate incident. When the pilot announced they were beginning the descent into Dallas-Fort Worth, Ebony felt the usual pop in her ears. She stared out the window at the sprawling city beneath. The tension from earlier had ebbed but not disappeared. As the plane touched down smoothly, Ebony congratulated the flight crew in her head for a well-executed approach. A chorus of seat belts unlatched once the plane reached the gate. Passengers bustled to retrieve their items. Ebony took her time. As soon as the cabin door opened, Ebony saw Cheryl come aboard for a moment, presumably to handle some arrival paperwork. The sight of her caused Ebony's pulse to quicken. She suppressed the urge to confront Cheryl right then and there. Instead, Ebony calmly stood, waited for the aisle to clear, then moved toward the exit. To Ebony's surprise, as she disembarked, she found Cheryl standing at the end of the jet bridge, speaking with another airline staff member. Cheryl shot Ebony an almost panicked glance, as though worried Ebony might say something. The presence of another staffer seemed to keep Cheryl from speaking first. Ebony debated whether to walk by or address her. She decided to hold her head high and pass without comment, but then the unexpected occurred. Cheryl grabbed Ebony's arm, gently, not enough to be forcibly rude, but enough to halt Ebony in her tracks. Ebony stiffened. She turned slowly, meeting Cheryl's eyes. "Yes?" Ebony asked, her voice measured. Cheryl's expression faltered between anxiety and defiance. "Look, I didn't mean earlier. I was just following the procedure for the boarding groups." Ebony held her gaze. "And your procedure was to deny a valid first-class passenger their right to board repeatedly." She asked it quietly, not wanting to draw attention from other disembarking passengers. Cheryl glanced at her colleague, who was now watching them. "Ma'am, maybe there was a misunderstanding. We get a lot of people trying to sneak into priority." Ebony could hear the half-baked excuse, but she also sensed the hint of an apology. She decided to respond calmly. "I had a ticket clearly stating first class. There was no misunderstanding on my part." Cheryl looked like she wanted to say more, but Ebony gave a curt nod and walked away, not wanting to prolong the confrontation in front of spectators. As she hurried off the jet bridge and into the terminal, Ebony's mind buzzed with the abruptness of Cheryl's attempt at either an apology or an excuse. She wasn't sure if it was spurred by genuine remorse or fear of repercussions. Either way, Ebony recognized that her next steps would define how deeply this airline would feel the consequences of that morning's discrimination. Ebony reached the terminal area, found an empty seat near a window, and pulled out her phone. She composed a brief but detailed message to her supervisor at the FAA's Dallas office, summarizing the flight's mechanical issue and verifying that the crew had followed proper protocol. Then, in a separate message, she outlined the gate agent incident, being very clear about the denial of priority boarding and Cheryl's manner. Ebony emphasized that it might indicate a pattern of discriminatory behavior She'd learned from Carlos that Cheryl had prior complaints. She requested the supervisor's advice on how to proceed, specifically whether Ebony should file an official complaint to the Department of Transportation or handle it internally through the FAA's channels, which sometimes collaborated with an airline's compliance team. After sending those messages, Ebony closed her eyes and exhaled. The morning had been emotionally draining. She had a couple of hours before she was due to meet a local FAA colleague for lunch and continue her inspection duties. But Ebony decided to take a short moment to recenter herself, perhaps grab a cup of coffee, and let the adrenaline fade. As she wandered through the terminal, she spotted Tristan from first class. He was on the phone, presumably making arrangements for ground transportation. He caught her eye, offered a wave, and Ebony waved back, appreciating the small thread of solidarity he represented. Then Ebony found a cafe and settled at a corner table. She sipped a latte while reading through the FAA's updated guidelines for passenger rights and equality. The more she read, the more she felt compelled to push for a thorough investigation. Gate agents and other airline staff were often the first line of customer interaction, and Ebony reasoned that big changes needed to start at that front line if fairness was to be truly enforced. Ebony's lunchtime meeting was with Geraldine "Jerry" Stanley, a longtime colleague who ran the FAA's Dallas regional operations. They met at a casual restaurant inside the airport, occupying a quiet table off to the side. Ebony started the conversation by reviewing the flight's mechanical delay. Jerry, a no-nonsense woman in her mid-50s, nodded, unconcerned. That part sounds routine enough. Good to hear they fixed the sensor properly. Then Ebony disclosed the gate agent incident. Jerry's eyes narrowed. Cheryl, you said? The gate agent's name was Cheryl? Yes, Ebony confirmed. And it appeared to be a pattern of discriminatory behavior, from what I gathered. Jerry let out a huff, her expression turning grim. You know, Ebony, the FAA doesn't directly handle discrimination complaints unless there's a safety component. That typically falls under DOT's consumer protection or the airline's internal HR. But if you witnessed it personally, that adds weight. We can't ignore it. Ebony traced the rim of her water glass. Carlos, the flight attendant, implied there have been passenger complaints before. Nothing seems to have changed. Jerry shrugged. Airlines can be slow to act unless they're hit with something that threatens them financially or tarnishes their brand. You know how it goes. She leaned forward. Now, as for your official capacity, if you want to escalate this, we can do so as part of a broader compliance check. It won't be just about that single gate agent. We could look into training programs, complaint resolution processes, the whole shebang. That's bigger than you might realize, Ebony. Ebony nodded, determined. I understand. But I can't keep ignoring these smaller incidents, especially if they point to a bigger problem. Jerry reached out and patted Ebony's hand. All right, I'll see what I can do. But you'll need to write a formal statement, Ebony. Names, times, specifics. You'd have to mention that you traveled in an undercover capacity for official reasons. You okay with that? Ebony swallowed. It meant she would no longer be a purely incognito inspector. Word might spread among airline staff that Ebony Baxter was someone to watch out for. But Ebony's moral compass refused to let bigotry slide. Yes, I'm okay with it. When Ebony wrapped up her lunch with Jerry, she walked to the baggage claim area to retrieve her suitcase. She intended to head to a nearby hotel where she would rest briefly before the next day's scheduled aircraft inspections. Yet, in the baggage area, Ebony found a small crowd of people from her flight, still waiting for luggage to arrive on the carousel. She recognized the father who had traveled with his children. They were fussing over lost or delayed bags. Ebony overheard the father talking to another passenger. Yeah, the gate agent was weird, the father said. I saw her turn away a lady in first class. She definitely seemed prejudiced. Ebony's ears perked up. She made her way closer, introducing herself politely. "Pardon me, I'm Ebony. We were on the same flight, right?" The man, who introduced himself as Damien, nodded. "Yes, sorry, was just ranting about that gate agent. I think she's the reason my kids and I got so much attitude. We asked for early boarding because traveling with kids is hectic. She told us we should have gotten to the gate earlier. We were there, but she insisted we wait until later groups. My kids are 5 and 8, it was tough," he sighed. "We're used to traveling, but she made it more complicated." Ebony offered a sympathetic nod. "I'm sorry you experienced that. Did you file a complaint or anything?" Damien shook his head. "We just want to get home." Complaints can be such a hassle. Unless someone is actually going to do something, it just disappears into the void. Ebony felt her heart sink. He was right. People often avoided lodging complaints because they believed them to be futile. Ebony realized that her impetus to escalate the matter was not just her personal experience, but the collective experiences of many passengers who might never speak up. That evening, Ebony settled into her hotel room, a modest but comfortable space that overlooked a busy freeway. She spread out her notes on a small desk, forming a plan of action. The FAA had given her clearance to conduct a surprise inspection at the same airline's gates and operational facilities at Dallas-Fort Worth the following morning. Normally, Ebony would focus on operational items, crew logs, safety equipment, maintenance records. But in light of the day's events, she decided to broaden her scope. She wanted to see the gate staff in action, especially during the busiest times, to assess whether the discriminatory behaviors were isolated or systemic. She typed up her formal statement about the morning incident, including Cheryl's name, time, flight number, and her refusal to let Ebony board with a valid first-class ticket. Ebony concluded her statement by requesting the FAA's cooperation with the Department of Transportation to investigate potential patterns of bias or misconduct at that airline's gates. Reading the statement back, Ebony felt a wave of satisfaction. She was doing the right thing. By 6:00 a.m. the next day, Ebony was back at the airport with a fresh sense of purpose. Armed with her official FAA credentials, she met with Jerry and another FAA official named Mark. Together, they approached the airline's management desk for unannounced inspections. Ebony noticed the flicker of alarm in the station manager's eyes. Surprise, FAA inspections always put staff on edge. However, Ebony kept her tone polite and professional. She requested access to the gates where flights were departing soon, specifically looking at priority boarding procedures, passenger assistance for those with children or disabilities, and general staff conduct. The station manager, after a moment's hesitation, escorted them through security. Ebony tried not to smirk at how swiftly an airline's management cooperated once they realized the FAA was serious. At gate 19, Ebony spotted a familiar face, Cheryl. Ebony hadn't expected to see her in Dallas, but apparently the airline had assigned Cheryl to this station, or perhaps she was traveling for a shift exchange. Ebony's heart pounded. She had come prepared for a random sample of gates, but fate seemed to have placed her right in the path of the woman who had dismissed her so rudely. Cheryl was working the desk for a flight bound for Los Angeles. The line of passengers snaked around the seating area. Ebony noticed a few anxious travelers stepping up to the desk, presumably to ask questions about seat assignments or baggage. Cheryl's expression was as stony as ever. Ebony exchanged a meaningful look with Jerry, who raised her eyebrows, as if to say, "This is interesting." They approached the gate together, Ebony leading. As soon as Cheryl registered Ebony's presence, a flush of recognition crossed her face. Ebony saw Cheryl stiffen. Ebony stepped forward, speaking in a calm, authoritative voice. "Good morning, Miss Cheryl. I'm Ebony Baxter with the FAA. My colleagues and I are here for an inspection." We'd like to observe the boarding process and speak with you about standard operating procedures. Cheryl struggled to maintain composure. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Good morning. Of course. Is this about yesterday? Ebony replied softly enough that passengers wouldn't overhear. It's about ensuring compliance with all relevant regulations, including fair and equitable treatment of passengers. We'll also be looking into other operational aspects. Jerry stepped in, brandishing her own badge. We'll just observe, ask a few questions, and watch how you handle the upcoming boarding. Cheryl swallowed, nodding. Yes, ma'am. Right this way, please. She gestured to a small side desk where Ebony and Jerry could stand without blocking passenger flow. Over the next half hour, Ebony and Jerry watched carefully as boarding for the Los Angeles flight began. First, pre-boarding for passengers with disabilities or those needing extra time. Cheryl recited the typical announcements, her tone surprisingly courteous. Ebony noted the difference from the day before, suspecting that Cheryl was on her best behavior in front of the FAA. Then came first class and priority boarding. When a black couple stepped up, Ebony held her breath, waiting to see how Cheryl would respond. Cheryl scanned their boarding passes briskly and allowed them to pass without incident. Ebony's eyes narrowed. Was Cheryl truly changed or just putting on a show? Then a snag occurred. Another passenger approached, claiming to have priority access, but Cheryl insisted his boarding pass indicated Group 2, not priority. The man argued he was a frequent flyer with status. Ebony watched how Cheryl handled it. She asked the man calmly for his membership number, typed it in, discovered. He did indeed have the status, and allowed him through with a professional apology. Ebony could hardly believe she was watching the same person from the previous day. The transformation was stark. It suggested that Cheryl knew exactly how to behave, but sometimes chose not to. Once the flight's final passengers boarded, Ebony and Jerry asked Cheryl for a brief interview about her training and protocols. Cheryl answered with all the correct corporate lines, how she valued customer service, how she was trained to handle priority boarding, how the airline had zero tolerance for discrimination. She gave a polished performance. Yet Ebony could sense the tension in Cheryl's posture, as if she expected Ebony to challenge her claims. Finally, Ebony decided to confront the topic directly. She flipped open her notepad. "Miss Cheryl, you remember me from yesterday. You initially refused to let me board despite my valid first-class ticket. It wasn't a misunderstanding. My boarding pass clearly showed seat 2A. Can you explain why that happened?" Cheryl's eyes flicked to Jerry, who maintained a neutral expression, then back to Ebony. I thought there might have been a glitch in the system," she stammered. "We had issues with some boarding passes that morning. I didn't mean to cause offense." Ebony pressed further. "You denied me multiple times, even after I clarified I had the correct ticket." Cheryl fumbled, wringing her hands. "I'm sorry if it came across that way. I was just following the guidelines as best as I could." Ebony felt the quiet fury simmer. She kept her tone even. "Guidelines don't instruct you to ignore a clearly marked first-class ticket. Guidelines don't instruct you to do a visual assessment of who looks like they belong in first class and who doesn't." Her gaze bored into Cheryl's. "I've heard from other passengers and even your colleague that this wasn't an isolated incident." Cheryl's face paled. For a moment, Ebony thought she saw the woman's eyes grow misty, perhaps from fear or shame. I'm sorry," she repeated, voice trembling. "It's been stressful, with everything going on." "I never meant to. Jerry cut in gently. "We want to make sure it doesn't happen again. The FAA, in cooperation with other agencies, will conduct a thorough review. Do you understand?" Cheryl nodded, lips pressed thin. She looked both contrite and terrified. Ebony sensed that the woman was on the verge of tears. Ebony couldn't muster pity just yet, but she reminded herself that the goal was correction, not destruction. "Thank you for your cooperation," Ebony said curtly. Word spread quickly among the airline staff that a surprise FAA inspection was in progress, possibly triggered by an incident of discrimination. Other gate agents straightened up their posture. Flight attendants passing through the terminal wore bright, if nervous, smiles, and several supervisors hovered near Ebony and Jerry's location, presumably to offer assistance or to keep an eye on them. Ebony found it revealing that the potential for repercussions motivated a sudden spike in courtesy and helpfulness. It spoke volumes about how accountability could drive better behavior. Jerry and Ebony interviewed a few more gate agents, collecting details about how often they received training on non-discrimination, conflict resolution, and assisting diverse passengers. Many admitted that the training was annual and somewhat perfunctory. "We do an online module, watch a couple of videos, answer multiple choice questions. That's it," one gate agent confessed. Ebony nodded, making notes that the training might not be robust enough to address ingrained biases. Meanwhile, Mark, the other FAA official, inspected the operational side, checking arrival and departure logs, verifying flight crew rosters, and ensuring no corners were being cut in the hustle of daily schedules. The synergy between Ebony, Jerry, and Mark made for a powerful trifecta of oversight. By late morning, they had compiled enough observations to form the foundation of a comprehensive report. Ebony hoped it would lead to substantive change, not just a slapped wrist. By noon, Ebony found herself physically and emotionally spent. She settled in a quiet corner of the terminal to gather her thoughts. Jerry appeared, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Ebony with a tired but satisfied smile. "So, how do you feel?" Ebony sighed, sipping the coffee gratefully. "Better. I feel like we made a statement that the FAA isn't just about mechanical safety, but also passenger rights. And maybe the airline will finally address Cheryl's behavior, but it's still just one step. It doesn't wipe away years of frustration mine or other passengers." Jerry squeezed Ebony's shoulder. "One step can lead to many more. I'll make sure our final report emphasizes the need for better training and oversight." The airline's management seemed rattled enough to take this seriously. Ebony nodded. "I'm glad." She paused, remembering her parents' proud faces whenever she talked about her job. They had taught her that being a black woman in a position of authority carried a responsibility to stand against discrimination. Today, Ebony had done just that. Days later, the airline announced it would be overhauling its gate agent training procedures, implementing stricter guidelines for handling priority boarding and enforcing a zero-tolerance policy toward discriminatory conduct. Cheryl, facing multiple documented complaints, was placed on indefinite leave pending further investigation. While Ebony never reveled in another person's downfall, she did believe in accountability. Sometimes, karma arrives on the wings of unwavering justice. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt wronged or witnessed injustice, know that one voice, one determined individual, can spark vital changes. Let Ebony's tale be a reminder that we should stand up for ourselves and for others, even when the odds seem stacked against us. Now, I'd like to invite you to be part of this message. Please like this video, share it with friends who need a tale of triumph over adversity, and subscribe to this channel for more stories that shine a light on truth. Together, we can create a community that values fairness, empathy, and the courage to make a difference.